In the early months of 1942, as the war in Europe churned through its third brutal year, the German soldiers who dominated the battlefields had little reason to fear the arrival of a new American tank. The M4 Sherman, freshly shipped across the Atlantic to join the Allied effort, was not the fearsome beast its creators hoped it would be, at least not in the eyes of the Wehrmacht. To the men who had cut their teeth on the lightning-fast campaigns of the Blitzkrieg, who had driven their Panzers through Poland, France, and deep into the Soviet steppe, this new machine was nothing short of laughable. They stood around their campfires, their breath fogging in the damp European air, trading jibes about the Sherman's ungainly shape and what they saw as its obvious flaws. It was, they said, a tank unworthy of the name. A clunky, underpowered contraption that could never stand toe-to-toe with the pride of German engineering. The Germans had a nickname for the Sherman, one that spread like wildfire through their ranks, the Tommy Cooker. The term was a cruel jab, born from the tank's gasoline engine, which they believed was a fatal weakness. A single well-placed shot, they claimed, would turn the Sherman into a blazing inferno, its crew trapped inside with no hope of escape. They'd seen it before. Tanks that burned too easily, crews that perished in flames, and they were certain the Sherman would be no different. The Panzer crews, who prided themselves on their battle-hardened experience, would point to their own diesel-powered machines, far less prone to catching fire, and shake their heads at what they saw as American recklessness. Why, they wondered aloud, would anyone design a tank that seemed to invite disaster? It was as if the Americans had built a machine meant to fail, a rolling coffin for the soldiers unlucky enough to crew it. Then there was the Sherman's gun, a 75mm cannon that to the Germans was woefully inadequate. They compared it to the fearsome 88mm guns mounted on their Tiger tanks, weapons that could punch through nearly any armor at staggering distances. The Sherman's cannon, by contrast, seemed like a toy, incapable of piercing the thick frontal plates of a Panther or the near-impenetrable hide of a Tiger. German tankers would recount stories of their own battles, where their high-velocity guns had shredded enemy armor with surgical precision, and they'd laugh at the thought of the Sherman shells bouncing harmlessly off their tanks' sloped armor. It wasn't just the gun's power that they mocked. It was the very idea that the Americans thought such a weapon could compete on the modern battlefield. To the Wehrmacht, who had spent years refining their armored tactics, the Sherman's armament was a relic, a throwback to an earlier era of warfare that Germany had long since surpassed. The Sherman's armor drew even more scorn. German soldiers would rap their knuckles against the hull of a captured Sherman, chuckling at how thin it felt compared to the robust steel of their own tanks. They called it paper armor, a tank that couldn't withstand the punch of a Panzerfaust, let alone the devastating anti-tank guns that littered the front lines. They had heard reports of Shermans being knocked out with ease, their sides and turrets crumpling under the impact of German shells. To the men who had faced the heavily armored Soviet T-34s and still come out on top, the Sherman seemed like a step backward, a machine built for quantity over quality. They imagined American factories churning out these tanks by the thousands, each one as flimsy as the last, and they shook their heads at the thought of an enemy so reliant on numbers rather than skill. It wasn't just the tank's technical shortcomings that fueled their derision. The Sherman's very appearance seemed to offend German sensibilities. Its boxy, utilitarian design lacked the sleek menace of a Panther or the hulking intimidation of a Tiger. It looked, to them, like something a farmer might use to plow a field, not a weapon meant to challenge the might of the Third Reich. "This is no tank," a grizzled Panzer commander was heard to say, his voice dripping with contempt. "It's a tractor dressed up for war." His words echoed through the ranks, repeated in mess halls and bunkers, becoming a kind of mantra for the German troops. They saw the Sherman as a symbol of American inexperience, a rushed attempt to play catch-up in a war that Germany had been fighting and winning for years. The United States, they believed, was a nation of industrial might but little martial finesse, and the Sherman was proof of it. The Germans' confidence wasn't just bravado, it was rooted in their own successes. They had conquered much of Europe with their panzers, outmaneuvering and outgunning their enemies at every turn. Their tank crews were veterans, men who had survived the brutal campaigns in the East and the lightning strikes in the West. They knew their machines inside and out, trusted their armor, their guns, their tactics. The arrival of the Sherman did little to shake that confidence. If anything, it reinforced their sense of superiority. They swapped stories of early encounters with American forces, where Shermans had bogged down in the mud, their tracks slipping, their engines straining under the weight of combat. They'd laughed at reports of American crews, green and untested, struggling to coordinate their movements or aim their guns effectively. To the Germans, the Sherman wasn't just a bad tank. It was a sign that the Americans were out of their depth, meddling in a war they didn't fully understand. In their command tents, German officers pored over maps and intelligence reports, barely glancing at mentions of American tank columns. The Sherman, they concluded, was a minor threat, a nuisance to be swept aside by the might of their armored divisions. They planned their strategies around the assumption that their panzers would roll over these new arrivals with the same ease they'd shown against the French, the British, and the Soviets. The Sherman they saw as a footnote in the larger story of German dominance, a machine that would break under the weight of their experience and firepower. They didn't fear it, they pitied it. But pity is a dangerous thing in war. It clouds judgment, breeds complacency. The German soldiers, so quick to mock the Sherman, failed to see the bigger picture. They didn't notice the sheer volume of these tanks pouring into the theater, the relentless output of American factories that could produce them faster than Germany could destroy them. They didn't consider the adaptability of the crews who, though green now, were learning with every skirmish. They didn't account for the ingenuity that would turn the Sherman's weaknesses into strengths, its simplicity into an asset. The Wehrmacht, so certain of their superiority, had sown the seeds of their own surprise. The Tommy cooker, the tractor, the paper-armored joke, they would soon learn it was no laughing matter. By late 1942, the M4 Sherman was no longer just a punchline for German soldiers. It was a machine they were starting to meet on the battlefield, and those early encounters, particularly in the sun-scorched deserts of North Africa, began to chip away at their smug dismissal. The Germans had laughed at the Sherman, called it a Tommy cooker, mocked its weak gun and thin armor. But now, as the tank rumbled across the sands of Tunisia and Libya, it was forcing them to take notice. These first clashes weren't decisive victories for the Americans, not yet, but they revealed something the Wehrmacht hadn't anticipated. The Sherman's potential wasn't in its individual strength, but in its numbers, its mobility, and the stubborn resilience of the crews learning to wield it. What began as a trickle of surprise would soon grow into a tide that German commanders could no longer ignore. The deserts of North Africa, with their wide-open expanses and shifting dunes, were the Sherman's proving ground. The campaign around El Alamein and the broader Tunisian front brought the tank into direct confrontation with German panzers, and the contrast between the two forces couldn't have been starker. The Germans relied on their Panzer IIIs and IVs, tanks they'd honed through years of combat, crewed by veterans who knew how to exploit every advantage. Their tactics were precise, their machines formidable, and their confidence unshaken. The Shermans, by contrast, were often manned by green American crews, men who trained in the fields of Georgia or the plains of Texas, far from the realities of war. These crews were still learning the rhythms of battle, still fumbling with their radios and struggling to spot targets through the haze of heat and dust. But for all their inexperience, they brought something the Germans hadn't fully reckoned with: numbers. The sheer volume of Shermans rolling onto the battlefield was staggering. American factories operating at a relentless pace had churned out thousands of these tanks, and they arrived in North Africa in waves. Where the Germans might field a company of meticulously maintained panzers, the Allies could deploy entire battalions of Shermans, their olive-drab hulls stretching across the horizon. German commanders, used to facing smaller, more cautious Allied formations, found themselves staring down a seemingly endless stream of tanks. A single Sherman might not intimidate a Panzer IV, but 10 Shermans, 20, 30, these were a different story.
The Germans began to realize that destroying one tank meant little when three more appeared to take its place. It was a kind of warfare they hadn't prepared for, one where quantity itself became a weapon. The Sherman's mobility was another surprise. The Germans had scoffed at its boxy frame, assuming it would be sluggish, bogged down by its own weight. But in the desert, where maneuverability was king, the Sherman proved nimbler than expected. Its reliable Christie suspension and wide tracks allowed it to traverse the sandy terrain with surprising ease, outpacing heavier German tanks that struggled in the soft ground. American crews, though raw, quickly learned to exploit this advantage. They'd dart around German positions, using the terrain to their benefit, kicking up clouds of dust to obscure their movements. In one skirmish near Kasserine Pass, a group of Shermans flanked a German Panzer company, catching them off guard and forcing a retreat. The Germans, expecting a head-on slugfest, were baffled by the Americans' speed and audacity. It wasn't the kind of warfare they'd mastered in Europe, and it threw them off balance. The Sherman's 575mm gun, so derided by the Germans, also began to show its worth in these early battles. True, it lacked the raw power to punch through the frontal armor of a Panzer IV at long range, and against the newer German tanks it was often outclassed. But in the chaotic, close-quarters fighting of the desert, where engagements happened at shorter distances, the Sherman's gun could still be deadly. Its high-explosive shells were particularly effective against soft targets, infantry, anti-tank guns, supply trucks, disrupting German positions and sowing chaos. American crews learned to aim for the weaker side and rear armor of enemy tanks, where even the modest 575 could do damage. They'd work in packs, coordinating their movements to overwhelm a single Panzer, hitting it from multiple angles before it could respond. These weren't the clean, decisive kills the Germans prided themselves on, but they were effective, and they added up. The German troops, who had once laughed at the Sherman's supposed weaknesses, began to grumble about its persistence. They'd knock out a tank, only to see another take its place, then another, and another. In one engagement near Kasserine Pass, a German anti-tank crew reported destroying a dozen Shermans, only to find their position overrun by a fresh wave of tanks they hadn't seen coming. The Americans, it seemed, didn't fight like the British or the Soviets. They didn't husband their resources or conserve their armor. They threw it into the fight, wave after wave, trusting in their ability to replace what was lost. It was a brutal, almost industrial approach to warfare, and it clashed with the Germans' preference for precision and efficiency. To the Wehrmacht, it felt almost unfair, like fighting a hydra that grew new heads with every strike. The Sherman's crews were learning too. These young Americans, many of whom had never seen combat before arriving in North Africa, were forced to grow up fast. They learned to use their tank speed to avoid the deadly 88mm guns that could shred their armor at 1,000 yards. They learned to coordinate with infantry and artillery, turning their tanks into part of a larger combined arms machine. Mistakes were costly. Tanks were lost to ambushes, to mechanical failures, to inexperience, but each loss taught a lesson. The crews began to develop a kind of scrappy ingenuity, rigging their tanks with sandbags or spare tracks for extra protection, learning to spot the telltale glint of a German gun before it fired. They weren't yet masters of their craft, but they were getting better, and the Germans were starting to notice. For the German commanders, these early clashes were a wake-up call, though not all of them heeded it. Some still clung to their disdain, dismissing the Sherman's successes as flukes or the result of their own tactical errors. They pointed to their kill ratios, often lopsided in their favor, and argued that the Sherman was still no match for a Panzer 100 handled well. But others, particularly the junior officers and tankers on the front line, saw something different. They saw an enemy that didn't break, that kept coming no matter how many tanks were destroyed. They saw a tank that, while flawed, was reliable, easy to repair, and always available. Reports began to filter back to German high command, warning of the growing American presence, of tank columns that seemed to stretch forever. The Tommy Cooker was starting to look less like a joke and more like a problem. These encounters in North Africa weren't the Sherman's triumph, not yet. The Germans still held the upper hand, their tanks and tactics superior in many ways. But the seeds of doubt were planted. The Sherman's mobility, its numbers, its sheer relentlessness were forcing the Germans to rethink their assumptions. They'd mocked the tank as a tractor, a toy, a death trap, but now they were seeing it in action, and it wasn't behaving like the failure they'd expected. The Americans were learning, adapting, and bringing more Shermans to the fight than the Germans could have imagined. The Wehrmacht's scorn was giving way to grudging respect, and in some quarters, a flicker of unease. The Sherman, it turned out, had a few tricks up its sleeve, and the battles to come would only make that clearer.
By the spring of 1943, the M4 Sherman was no longer just a curiosity on the battlefields of North Africa and the edges of Europe. It was becoming a force that the German army could no longer dismiss with a sneer. The laughter that had once echoed around Wehrmacht campfires, the cruel nicknames like Tommy Cooker, were fading, replaced by a growing unease. The Sherman, once mocked as a flimsy, underpowered tractor, was starting to prove itself in ways the Germans hadn't anticipated. In the dusty hills of Tunisia and the early skirmishes in Sicily, the tank began to roll through German lines with the ferocity and cunning that caught even the most seasoned Panzer commanders off guard. These moments of shock, where the Sherman's sheer numbers, adaptability, and the grit of its crews turned the tide, marked a turning point. The Germans were learning, to their dismay, that underestimating the Sherman was a mistake they could ill afford. The Tunisian campaign, stretching into early 1943, was where the Sherman truly began to show its teeth. The Germans had expected to hold their ground in North Africa, relying on their battle-hardened Panzer divisions and the formidable anti-tank guns that had shredded Allied armor in earlier battles. They'd grown accustomed to facing British tanks or Soviet T-34s, machines they understood and could counter with practiced precision. But the Shermans were different. They came in droves, a relentless flood of steel that seemed to pour from every ridge and wadi. American commanders, now more seasoned after the bruising lessons of Kasserine Pass and El Guatar, had begun to master the art of combined arms warfare. They paired their tanks with infantry, artillery, and air support, turning the Sherman into a cog in a larger, more devastating machine. The Germans, who prided themselves on their tactical finesse, found themselves facing an enemy that fought with brute persistence, overwhelming their carefully laid plans. One such moment came during the Battle of Medjez el Bab in April 1943, a clash that would linger in the memories of German tankers. A German defensive line, bristling with Panzer IVs and 88mm guns, held a key position along a narrow valley. They dug in, confident that their superior firepower and entrenched positions would repel any Allied advance. But as dawn broke, a low rumble grew into a roar, and a wave of Shermans crested the horizon. There were dozens of them, moving faster than the Germans expected, their tracks kicking up clouds of dust that choked the air and obscured their numbers. The American crews had learned from earlier defeats, using the terrain to mask their approach, darting between hills and gullies to avoid the deadly long-range fire of German guns. Before the Germans could fully react, the Shermans were upon them, their 75mm guns spitting high-explosive shells that tore into infantry positions and anti-tank emplacements. The Germans were stunned. Their anti-tank gunners, trained to pick off targets with surgical accuracy, found themselves overwhelmed by the sheer volume of tanks. A single Sherman might fall to an 88mm shell, its hull erupting in flames, but two more would take its place, then three, then five. The Americans didn't fight like the Germans expected. They didn't pause to regroup or hesitate under fire. Instead, they pressed forward, their tanks weaving through the chaos, targeting the weaker flanks of German positions. In one devastating push, a company of Shermans broke through a gap in the line, rolling over machine gun nests and scattering infantry who'd relied on their Panzer support to hold the ground. The German tankers, scrambling to reposition their Panzers, found themselves outmaneuvered, their heavier machines struggling to keep up with the Sherman's relentless pace. What made these breakthroughs so shocking wasn't just the numbers, it was the ingenuity of the American crews. The Sherman, for all its flaws, was a mechanic's dream, simple to maintain, easy to repair, and endlessly adaptable. Crews had begun modifying their tanks in the field, bolting on extra armor plates, piling sandbags on the hulls,
or attaching spare tracks to vulnerable spots. These makeshift upgrades didn't make the Sherman invincible, but they gave it a fighting chance against the German guns that had once torn through it with ease. In Tunisia, stories spread of Sherman's surviving hits that would have crippled them months earlier, their crews bailing out to patch holes and get back in the fight. The Germans, who prided themselves on their engineering precision, were baffled by this scrappy resilience. They'd built their tanks to dominate through quality. The Americans, it seemed, were winning through adaptability and sheer determination. The Sherman's versatility extended beyond its physical modifications. American commanders were learning to exploit the tank's strengths in ways the Germans hadn't foreseen. In the close-quarters fighting of the Tunisian hills, where long-range duels gave way to chaotic scrambles, the Sherman's 75mm gun proved more effective than its critics had claimed. Its high-explosive shells could devastate infantry and light vehicles, softening up German defenses before the tanks closed in. The Americans also began using smoke rounds to blind German gunners, allowing their Shermans to maneuver into flanking positions. In one engagement, a German Panzer company found itself enveloped by Shermans that appeared from a smokescreen, hitting their weaker side armor and forcing a retreat. The German tankers, accustomed to dictating the terms of battle, were left reeling, their confidence shaken by an enemy they'd underestimated. The shock wasn't limited to North Africa. As the Allies pushed into Sicily in July 1943, the Sherman continued to surprise. The island's rugged terrain, with its narrow roads and rocky hills, should have favored the defenders, but the Americans turned it to their advantage. Shermans moved in tight, coordinated groups, supported by infantry who cleared out anti-tank teams and artillery that pounded German strongpoints. In one daring assault near Gela, a battalion of Shermans smashed through a German defensive line, their speed and numbers overwhelming a mix of Panzer IIIs and Italian tanks. The Allies had expected to hold the line with ease, but the Shermans kept coming, their crews undeterred by losses, their tanks rolling over obstacles that would have stalled heavier machines. By the time the dust had settled, the German position was in tatters, their tanks either destroyed or abandoned, their infantry scattered. For the German troops, these moments were a bitter pill. They'd built their reputation on armored dominance, on tanks that inspired fear and tactics that outwitted their enemies. Now they were facing an opponent that didn't play by their rules. The Sherman's crews, once mocked as green and inept, were proving themselves quick learners. They'd studied the Germans' tactics, adapted to their strengths, and found ways to exploit their weaknesses. The Americans didn't need to match the Panther's firepower or the Tiger's armor. They only needed to keep the pressure on, to overwhelm with numbers and outmaneuver with speed. German after-action reports began to reflect a new tone, less derision, more caution. Officers noted the Sherman's reliability, its ability to stay in the fight even after taking damage, and the relentless supply chain that ensured new tanks were always arriving. The shock of these breakthroughs rippled through the German ranks. Tankers who had once joked about the paper armor now spoke of Shermans that absorbed hits and kept moving. Infantry who'd relied on Panzerfaust to stop Allied tanks found themselves outflanked by fast-moving columns they couldn't pin down. Commanders who'd dismissed the Sherman as a nuisance began to revise their strategies, ordering their forces to prioritize knocking out American tanks before they could close the distance. But even these adjustments came too late for some. In the final days of the Tunisian campaign, as the Axis forces were squeezed into a shrinking pocket, the Shermans played a key role in sealing their fate. They rolled through German lines, cutting off supply routes and isolating strongpoints, leaving the Wehrmacht with no choice but surrender. The Sherman's success in these moments wasn't about perfection. It was about persistence. The tank still had its flaws. Its armor was still vulnerable, its guns still outclassed by the best German weapons, but it was proving to be more than the sum of its parts. It was a machine that could be produced in staggering numbers, repaired in the field, and adapted to any situation. Its crews, growing more confident with every battle, were turning the Sherman into a weapon the Germans hadn't expected. The shock of these encounters forced the Wehrmacht to confront an uncomfortable truth. The tank they'd mocked was no longer a joke. It was a threat, one that was only growing stronger as the war ground on.
By the summer of 1943, the M4 Sherman had carved a new reputation on the battlefields of North Africa and Sicily, one that no longer fit the German caricature of a weak, flame-prone tractor. The tank, once the butt of Wehrmacht jokes, had proven itself a persistent and adaptable foe, its sheer numbers and surprising agility overturning German expectations in a series of bruising encounters. As the Allies pushed into Italy and prepared for the invasion of Western Europe, German commanders found themselves facing a sobering reality. The Sherman was not just a nuisance, it was a problem that demanded a response. The scorn that had once defined their view of the American tank gave way to urgency, as officers and tankers scrambled to adapt their tactics, fortifications, and mindset to counter a strategy they hadn't foreseen. The realization that the Sherman's strengths lay not in its individual prowess, but in its relentless availability, versatility, and the growing skill of its crews forced the Germans into a frantic recalibration, one that would test the limits of their vaunted armored doctrine. The Italian campaign, with its rugged mountains, narrow valleys, and fortified German lines, was where the German High Command began to fully grasp the impact of the Sherman. The Wehrmacht had expected the terrain to favor their defensive tactics, with carefully placed anti-tank guns and Panzer units positioned to exploit choke points. They'd faced Allied tanks before, British Matildas, Soviet T-34s, and had learned to counter them with disciplined firepower and maneuver. But the Shermans, flooding the battlefield in numbers that seemed inexhaustible, were different. They didn't fight like the Germans expected. American commanders, now seasoned by their trials in North Africa, had honed a strategy that leaned heavily on the Sherman's strengths: its reliability, its ability to operate in large groups, and its capacity to keep moving even in the face of losses. The Germans, who'd built their success on quality and precision, were suddenly grappling with an enemy that fought with overwhelming quantity and stubborn persistence. In the battles around Salerno and the Volturno River, German commanders saw the Sherman strategy in full force. American tank units didn't just advance, they swarmed. A single Panzer company might face dozens of Shermans, supported by infantry and artillery, moving in coordinated waves that seemed to absorb losses without breaking stride. The Germans would knock out a tank, its hull smoldering in the Italian dust, only to see two more roll forward, their 75mm guns hammering away at infantry positions or lobbing smoke rounds to blind anti-tank crews. The Sherman's simplicity, once mocked as a flaw, was proving to be a strength. When a tank was damaged, American crews could often repair it on the spot using spare parts that flowed freely from Allied supply lines. German Panzers, by contrast, were complex machines, often sidelined by mechanical issues or a lack of replacement parts. A knocked-out Sherman was back in action within hours. A damaged Panther might sit idle for days. This realization hit German commanders like a cold wind. In their command posts, maps were redrawn. Reports poured over with growing alarm. Officers who'd once dismissed the Sherman as paper-armored began to note its reliability in their dispatches. The tank's ability to stay operational, even in the grueling conditions of Italy's muddy roads and rocky hills, was a stark contrast to their own tanks, which required constant maintenance. The Sherman's crews, once derided as green, were showing a knack for improvisation. They'd learned to use their tanks' speed to outflank German positions, to coordinate with air support that could pin down Panzer units, and to exploit the terrain in ways that nullified the Germans' long-range firepower. In one clash near Anzio, a group of Shermans outmaneuvered a German defensive line by racing through a narrow valley, catching the defenders off guard and destroying a battery of anti-tank guns before they could fire a shot. The German commander, expecting a cautious advance, was left stunned, his carefully laid plans unraveling in minutes. The Germans began to adapt, but it wasn't easy. Their armored doctrine, built around the superiority of tanks like the Panther and Tiger, relied on engaging enemies at long range, where their high-velocity guns could dominate. But the Shermans refused to play that game. American commanders favored close-quarters engagements, where their numbers and mobility could overwhelm German positions before the heavier tanks could bring their firepower to bear.
To counter this, German officers ordered their anti-tank units to dig in deeper, fortifying key positions with layers of mines, barbed wire, and camouflaged guns. They began to deploy their panzers in smaller, more flexible groups, hoping to counter the Sherman's swarming tactics with rapid counterattacks. But these adjustments often fell short. The Shermans were too numerous, their crews too quick to exploit any gap in the line. In one desperate stand near Monte Cassino, a German panzer unit found itself surrounded by Shermans that had slipped through a forested ridge, their guns firing from angles the Germans hadn't anticipated. The panzers fought bravely, but the sheer volume of Allied tanks overwhelmed them, leaving the position in ruins. The realization extended beyond tactics to logistics. The Wehrmacht's supply lines, stretched thin by years of war, struggled to keep their tanks fueled and armed. The Sherman, by contrast, was backed by an American industrial machine that seemed unstoppable. Factories across the Atlantic churned out tanks, parts, and ammunition at a pace Germany couldn't match. A German officer, captured in Italy, was overheard marveling at the sight of a Sherman repair depot, where damaged tanks were stripped, rebuilt, and sent back to the front in a matter of days. He said, "We destroy one and they send 3 more. How do you fight an enemy that never runs out?" This question haunted German commanders, who began to see the Sherman not as a single tank, but as a symbol of America's overwhelming industrial might, a machine that could be replaced faster than it could be destroyed. The scramble to adapt wasn't just about tactics or logistics, it was also a psychological shift. German tankers who'd once laughed at the Tommy Cooker now spoke of the Sherman with a mix of grudging respect and dread. They'd seen their comrades' tanks overwhelmed by waves of Shermans, their defensive lines shattered by coordinated assaults they couldn't predict. In some instances, a lone Sherman, its turret damaged, rammed a German anti-tank gun to protect its infantry, an act of defiance that left the German crew stunned. These stories chipped away at the Wehrmacht's confidence, replacing their earlier arrogance with a creeping sense of unease. The Sherman wasn't the invincible juggernaut they'd feared in the Soviet T-34, but it was proving to be something just as dangerous, a relentless, adaptable foe that refused to be broken. As the Allies prepared for the invasion of Normandy in 1944, German commanders intensified their efforts to counter the Sherman. They studied American tactics, noting how the tank was used not as a standalone weapon, but as part of a broader, combined arms strategy. They ordered their engineers to develop new anti-tank weapons like improved Panzerfausts and mines, designed to exploit the Sherman's still vulnerable armor. They trained their panzer crews to target the tank's weaker side and rear plates, where even the 75mm gun could do damage. But these measures were stopgaps, reactions to an enemy that was evolving faster than they could keep up. The Germans were no longer fighting a tank they could mock. They were fighting a system, one that combined numbers, adaptability, and an unshakable supply chain into a force that was reshaping the battlefield. The realization was bitter for the Wehrmacht. They'd built their armored forces on the belief that quality would always triumph over quantity, that their superior tanks and tactics would carry the day. But the Sherman, with its unassuming design and persistent presence, was proving them wrong. It wasn't the best tank on the battlefield, but it didn't need to be. It was the tank that kept coming, the tank that could be repaired, replaced, and thrown back into the fight. German commanders, scrambling to adapt, knew they were facing a new kind of war, one in which their old assumptions no longer held. As they braced for the Allied invasion of Europe, they couldn't shake the feeling that the Sherman, the tank they'd once laughed at, was about to play a starring role in their undoing.
By the summer of 1944, the M4 Sherman had transformed from a scorned newcomer into a relentless force that the German army could no longer underestimate. Its journey through the battlefields of North Africa, Italy, and now the hedgerows of Normandy revealed a tank that thrived not on raw power, but on adaptability, resilience, and the sheer weight of its numbers. As the Allies pushed deeper into Europe, driving the Wehrmacht back toward the heart of the Third Reich, the Sherman stood at the forefront of their armored spearhead. It wasn't the mightiest tank of the war. German Tigers and Panthers held that title, but it didn't need to be. The Sherman's legacy was built on its ability to evolve, to meet the demands of a brutal, ever-changing war, and to carry the Allies to victory through a combination of ingenuity, persistence, and industrial might. Its impact reshaped the very nature of armored warfare, leaving a mark that would endure long after the guns fell silent in 1945. The invasion of Normandy marked the Sherman's coming of age. In the Bocage country of northern France, with its thick hedgerows and narrow lanes, the tank faced some of the fiercest fighting of the war. German Panzer divisions, equipped with formidable Panthers and Tigers, waited in ambush, their high-velocity guns capable of tearing through the Sherman's armor at long range. Yet the Americans had learned from their earlier campaigns. They no longer sent their tanks into battle alone, but as part of a coordinated machine, supported by infantry, artillery, and waves of fighter bombers that could pin down German armor. The Sherman's reliability and ease of maintenance shone in this grueling environment. While German tanks, complex and prone to breakdowns, often languished in repair yards, Shermans could be patched up in the field, their crews swapping out engines or tracks under the cover of night to keep them rolling. The tank's adaptability was its greatest strength. American engineers and crews had spent years refining the Sherman, turning its simplicity into an asset. Variants rolled off production lines tailored to specific needs, Shermans fitted with flamethrowers to clear bunkers, others with mine-clearing flails to breach fortified lines, and some with up-gunned 76mm cannons to better counter German armor. In the field, crews added their own modifications, sandbags, logs, even salvaged German armor plates to bolster protection. This flexibility allowed the Sherman to take on roles its designers had never imagined, from leading assaults to supporting infantry in urban fighting. In the Battle of the Bulge, when German forces launched a desperate counteroffensive, Shermans held the line in freezing snow, their crews braving sub-zero temperatures to keep their tanks operational. They didn't always win the head-to-head duels with heavier German tanks, but they didn't need to. Their numbers and versatility ensured they could outlast and outmaneuver their foes. The Germans, by now, had come to respect the Sherman, a far cry from the mockery of 1942. Their commanders had tried to adapt, deploying new weapons like the Panzerfaust and Panzerschreck to counter the Allied tank swarms, but these were stopgaps against an enemy that seemed inexhaustible. The American industrial machine, which the Germans had once underestimated, was the Sherman's true weapon. Factories in Detroit and across the United States produced over 49,000 Shermans by the end of the war, dwarfing Germany's output of Panthers and Tigers. This flood of tanks backed by an equally robust supply chain meant that the Allies could replace losses faster than the Germans could inflict them. A German officer, captured near the Rhine in 1945, summed it up bitterly. We could destroy 10 Shermans, but there were always 10 more waiting. They wore us down, not with better tanks, but with endless tanks. This relentless production, paired with the tank's ability to keep fighting, turned the Sherman into a symbol of Allied resilience. The Sherman's role in the Allied victory went beyond its physical presence. It reshaped how armies thought about armored warfare. Before the Sherman, tanks were often seen as elite weapons, designed for decisive head-on battles where quality trumped all. The Germans had perfected this approach, crafting tanks like the Tiger to dominate through sheer firepower. But the Sherman introduced a new philosophy. A tank didn't need to be the best to win. It needed to be reliable, adaptable, and available. It needed to work as part of a larger system, where infantry, artillery, and air support amplified its strengths. The Americans proved that a good enough tank, produced in vast numbers and wielded with growing skill, could overcome even the most formidable opponents. This approach, born in the crucible of World War II, would influence military thinking for decades, shaping the design of future tanks and the strategies of modern armies. The Sherman's crews were as much a part of its legacy as the tank itself. These men, many of whom had never seen combat before 1942, grew into some of the most effective tankers of the war. They learned to exploit the Sherman's speed to flank German positions, to use smoke and terrain to neutralize the enemy's long-range advantage, and to coordinate with other units to devastating effect. Their courage, often overlooked in the shadow of the tank's flaws, was a driving force behind its success. Stories abounded of crews who fought on despite overwhelming odds, Shermans that held bridges against German counterattacks, crews who repaired their tanks under fire, or tankers who sacrificed their vehicles to protect retreating infantry.
These acts of bravery, repeated across countless battlefields, turned the Sherman more than a machine. It became a testament to the human spirit, to the ability to adapt and endure in the face of adversity. As the war drew to a close in 1945, the Sherman was there, rolling through the shattered cities of Germany, crossing the Rhine and liberating towns from the grip of the Third Reich. It wasn't the tank that won the war single-handedly. No single weapon could claim that. But it was the tank that carried the Allies forward, mile after grueling mile. Its presence on every major front, from the beaches of Normandy to the forests of the Ardennes, made it a constant in the Allied advance. The Germans, who had once laughed at its boxy frame and gasoline engine, had been forced to reckon with its tenacity. Their own tanks, though fearsome, couldn't match the Sherman's ability to keep fighting, to keep moving, to keep coming. By the time the Nazi regime collapsed, the Sherman had become a symbol of the Allied victory, a machine that through adaptability and sheer persistence had helped topple an empire. The legacy of the Sherman endures in the lessons it taught. It showed that victory in armored warfare wasn't just about building the biggest or most powerful tank. It was about building a tank that could be everywhere, that could adapt to any challenge, and that could support a broader strategy. The Sherman's design influenced post-war tanks, from the American M46 Patton to the Soviet T-55, which borrowed its emphasis on reliability and mass production. Its role in combined arms warfare became a blueprint for modern militaries, where tanks operate not in isolation, but as part of a coordinated whole. Even today, military planners study the Sherman's campaigns, maddeningly marveling at how a tank once dismissed as inferior became a linchpin of victory. In the end, the Sherman's story is one of transformation. It began as a target of ridicule, a machine mocked by an enemy convinced of its own superiority. But through the ingenuity of its crews, the might of American industry, and a strategy that played to its strengths, it became a cornerstone of the Allied triumph. It wasn't perfect. It burned too easily. Its guns struggled against the heaviest German armor, but it didn't need to be perfect. It needed to be there, in the mud, the dust, and the snow, carrying its crews forward, breaking through lines, and paving the way for victory. The M4 Sherman, the tractor-turned-tank, didn't just fight a war, it changed how wars were fought, leaving a legacy that echoes through the annals of military history.